Well, hello everyone. Now that we've finished the first reading, first week of the course, I'll do this occasionally, maybe every week, maybe a little bit less frequently, but certainly occasionally do a video where we look at some of the things that people have said on the discussion boards. This is all from week one, from our Epicurus reading. I just find it easier, frankly, to go through the board as a whole and think about what people have said and just cut and paste and make some commentary on things rather than post on the board myself. So we're reading Epicurus, which is, it's bound to make some impact on you, no matter what your ultimate commitments are with regard to the nature of death and whether you agree with Epicurus or not. And certainly we'll have any number of readings which disagree with Epicurus. It is something of a shock, at least in the sense that it kind of shakes you awake in terms of your thinking about death. Again, whether or not you ultimately agree with Epicurus, he does challenge us, and I think that one of the lasting effects of reading Epicurus, and it's funny because he doesn't exactly say this, but he kind of pushes you in this direction, is making the distinction between dying and death. And once we've made that distinction, he's kind of got us, in a way, logically, in terms of his conclusion. Somebody put it this way on the boards last week: the act of dying may be bad. And I think that that's true. According to Epicurus, it may be bad because it may be painful. But actual death, nobody will experience because it is the end of all human awareness. That is I think that's very good. That's the essential point he's making, is that if death is the end of all awareness, then death itself is not anything, has no value to us, good or bad. It's not, because it's not something we could possibly experience, since it is the end of all experience. Now, I'm not saying that that's the end of it. I mean, you got to think about that. That leads to certain puzzles when we say that death is simply the end of all experience and therefore nothing that can be experienced itself. But I think that is a very powerful point. And yes, he basically stated, how can we fear something that we will never experience? He does not believe that we will feel any pain or be aware of anything when we die. That's a huge point being made. Very, very good to keep that in mind. Ultimately, I think his reasons for saying that death is nothing to us is that for something to be something for us, it has to have some value, good or bad. Death has no such value. It is neither pleasurable or painful, or it's not a matter, to put it in sort of more modern terms, it's not something we will actually ever experience. It's according to the way that Epicurus sets up his assumed definition of death as the privation of all awareness. It's just logically impossible that it's something that we could ever be aware of. And so, yes, I think that ultimately is the practical message of the letter to Menoikos, is that there's no reason to fear. That would be a baseless and a groundless fear. And as I think people really caught on, the larger philosophy that his philosophy of death is a part of is Epicureanism, hedonism. That is, that life is about pleasures. Life is about pursuing pleasures and avoiding pains. Now, there's that has to be taken in a certain way, right? He does not. No Epicurean, respectable Epicurean, will confine themselves to physical pleasures. Ultimately, somebody like Epicurus would say the highest, best, most pleasurable pleasures are the pleasures of learning and probably friendship. But in any case, that to feel fear and therefore pain, to suffer because of our fear of death or anxiety about death would be irrational. It would be an unnecessary deduction from the enjoyment of life. And I think this response was really probably pretty close to mine when I finally read Epicurus. I was a philosophy teacher for many years before I got around to Epicurus. And once I did, I knew I could never teach this course the same way. He said, at first I was also shocked when I read Death is Nothing to Us. I could not understand why he would say such a thing, and nor could I. And then as this person did, and as I did, when we read on and actually grasp his reasoning, it makes perfect sense. Again, things that make perfect sense are not necessarily true, right? But they are to be contended with. But there was, I think everybody experiences something of a shock reading Epicurus. First of all, we're not very good at talking about death. Although I've had a lot of practice teaching this course for many years, but I'm probably still not very good at it. It's a subject that is not always proper to bring up. And then when somebody is so just sort of matter of fact, well, death is nothing. And this is a subject that we avoid because it's a painful subject. It's a subject that we avoid thinking about because it's depressing or frightening. And for somebody to just to come out and say, well, it's nothing to you. It's not something to be feared. It's not a matter that's worth your thought is something of a shock. And then when we read his reasoning, very, very compact little reasoning he does, it makes perfect sense. So that Epicurus may ultimately be wrong. I always want to say that about any philosopher. That they may be wrong, but that's not obviously wrong. It's something to be contended with, whether you ultimately agree with it or not. Well, any discussion of death ultimately does, I think, somewhere end up with a discussion of a possible survival of death. This person said, we have no idea what will happen once we die. I'd just like to say right there that that's probably right, but that Epicurus would thoroughly disagree with you. That is, Epicurus seems to know exactly what will happen when he dies, and that is nothing will happen. That there'll be no more happenings. Which is not to belittle what's said here, not at all, because what that person wrote may be exactly right. We may have no idea, but I think if you're an Epicurean with regard to death, you do think you have a pretty good handle on what happens when we die, because nothing happens. There's no happening at all. She continued, humans create concepts such as heaven and hell or reincarnation to make us feel better and more comfortable with the idea of dying, since something comes after and not complete darkness. Dying sounds very scary and bad, but the person who has died is not experiencing fear or pain since the person is gone. Very Epicurean statement to end there. And I think, okay, we should feel free, absolutely free to express our opinions. And this is a widely held opinion, I think, that our notions of the afterlife are certainly have been formulated by human beings. Now, whether that means they've been sort of fabricated by human beings or whether they reflect some kind of actual truth, that's where we begin to part ways, I suppose. But this is a fully sensible position that, and many a philosopher and non-philosopher has held the position that our concepts of the afterlife are coping mechanisms that we use to get over, or not get over, but to deal with our fear of death. Certainly, any number of people have thought that. I'm not here to tell you that's right or wrong. But again, it's a perfectly sensible position. I mean, you can't just dismiss it. It makes plenty of sense that we would make up stories to console ourselves about our fears. Now, whether that is ultimately true or not, I do not know, but it certainly makes sense. Although I have to say, again, Epicurus would disagree with you. He thinks he knows what will happen when we die. I mean, it's not, the thing is, from the Epicurean point of view, death is not really a mystery. It's just something you need to think through. And once you've thought it through, you sort of realize what it is and you move on because you realize it's just not that big a deal. This is another sentiment with regard to the sort of psychology of death and the psychology of believing in an afterlife, regardless of what does happen. Believing in something positive makes the thought of death sound a lot better. Very pragmatic. The pragmatists were American philosophers who said the truth value of any statement or any belief is whether it's useful, not whether it corresponds with some objective reality that we don't conceive of very clearly, or the idea of which we can't really coherently conceive of. That is, I think, is a very pragmatic statement. I mean, you can say, well, death is a mystery, or you can never really establish with any certainty that there's an afterlife. But all of us know that for a lot of people, it is necessary, maybe not a necessary truth in the sense of being obviously true, but necessary pragmatically, practically. I do not know many people who are completely fearless that they do not even fear death. Nor do I. But I don't know many people. But I'd have to agree. And you know, I'll tell you, I mean, having taught this course probably for 15 years now, almost continually. So I've thought about death a lot. I'm not saying I've thought about death deeply, but I've thought about death a lot. And I've thought a lot about what Epicurus said. And although it makes a lot of sense, I cannot say personally that I would be that person who doesn't fear death. I think that would be untrue. I happen to think there are people who don't fear death. And most of them are people who just haven't thought about it. But there are people who have thought about it and still don't fear it. And I am very impressed by those people. Let's see. I agree with Epicurus' idea that death is nothing to us. Reason being that death is simply out of our control and is inevitable for everyone. So why should we fear it or try to run from it? Instead, we should be present and in the moment, doing what we can to grow and learn from the bad and good experiences of life. Very Epicurean sentiment. Nothing I would disagree with in this, except to say that Epicurus's emphasis in telling us not to fear death is not on its inevitability. There is a certain line of thought where you can say, well, that which I do not have control over, for instance, my mortality, is something that I shouldn't be afraid of, I shouldn't concern myself with. That's not exactly what Epicurus says. He really does believe that death is nothing. So it's not the inevitability of death that he's concerned with, but it's non-existence, really. It's not so much that death is inevitable, it's that death won't hurt that he's really focusing on. So this is an interesting thought. It's just a little different from what Epicurus actually says. But this being present in the moment, it's a good thing to keep in mind. Later on, we'll be reading an essay by Glenn Gray about the idea of death and existentialism. And I would say, from what I can make out from his description of existentialism, and that is that the being present in the moment thing has a lot to do with the idea of death. That is, that it's only through accepting one's death in a completely honest way that you can be present in the moment, because the moment always contains the possibility of death. So unless you're open to death, you really can't be open to the moment. This is, I would say, I'm not a great reader of Martin Heidegger, but I would say that is the version that makes most sense of his characterization of human existence itself as a being towards death. Which is much contested and will be something that at the end of the course the philosopher Paul Landsberg will attempt to refute. But the Heideggerian idea is very powerful, as we'll see, that we cannot really be there in the moment. We cannot embrace reality. We cannot live in truth, just sort of live our lives authentically and out of denial unless we accept our mortality. And from his version, that mortality is final. The existentialist, classic existentialist, is an atheist. There are believing existentialists, but that's something a little different. I think that the classic existentialist is the one who says that unless you accept that your death is your finitude, it's the absolute limit of your existence, then you're not really accepting death. That's why you have to go through this experience of dread. But that's a good thing to keep in mind. Let's see. Yeah, finally, quote from Epicurus: "We must remember that the future is neither wholly ours nor wholly not ours, so that neither must we count upon it as quite certain to come, nor despair of it as quite certain not to come." This line stood out to me because it is basically saying that nothing's guaranteed, but also nobody knows when death will come. So do not count time away. I honestly don't know how I personally feel about all this. I am definitely one of those people who fear death in a way. I think it is just the unknown of it all. I think this is a very interesting and fairly common type of response to reading Epicurus and beginning to think about death is, and very good, because when we do philosophy, we try to learn things. But the first step in learning things in philosophy is admitting one's own confusion about things. I don't know, is what Socrates said. The courage to say, I don't know. I don't know what is true. Is the first step. It's great, Epicurus, and I do believe that he didn't fear death. But I don't know that I don't fear death. Sure, I do. What day is it? I mean, I don't know. I'm not always a clear thinker, right? And the unknown of it all. Again, I would have to agree, the unknown of it all. Except I would say again that from Epicurus's point of view, death is not an unknown. I mean, there is a paradox. If death is nothing, how can you know it? And how can you know nothing? And this will lead us into all sorts of metaphysical things, which might be interesting. But the experience or the phenomenon of human beings dying to an Epicurean is not really unknown. It's only unknown if you have what Landsberg would call hope of a survival of death. But Epicurus is not a survivalist in that way. I think of Epicurus as an annihilationist, which is just to say that he believes that we become nothing at death. And although that may be hard to grasp intellectually, or even to some extent, as the existentialists would say, hard to admit emotionally or psychologically, for him it's not the unknown. We know what happens. It's like, for us there is the mystery, as Paul Landsberg would say. When a human being especially dies, we are left with a great question. And that question is, where are they now? But when other things go away, we don't consider it a great mystery or a great conceptual puzzle. I have favorite buildings or nice buildings in the city of Philadelphia that have been torn down in my lifetime. And I remember them, I remember a church right around my corner, 17th and Bainbridge. It was torn down, and it was a darn shame because it just threw up, stupid houses. This historic church, and I remember that church in my mind, and I know it used to be there, and I know that it's not there now. I don't think of it as, I don't think of it necessarily as making any sense to say it continues to exist in another form. I would say it came into existence at a certain time. It existed as a church, a building. People used it, stood there for decades and decades, and now it is no more. But I don't. So one could certainly just say, well, that's the way it is with human beings. They come into the world, they become persons, they exist, they live their lives, and then they are no more. And we remember them for a while, and then not even that. So, that's one way of looking at it. I would say that probably the Epicurean way of looking at it, which is not to say that it dispels the mystery. I'm not saying that at all. There's more to death than what Epicurus says. On the other hand, it would be a mischaracterization of Epicurus himself to say that he thought that death was a mystery. That's just my personal interpretation. So, it's good to have feedback on the discussion boards, what I can say. It's always interesting to read what you have to say. I was very glad to see such a lively discussion about Epicurus. And let's hope that, we have a good experience reading Nagel. And I'll talk to you again soon.